Good evening to everybody. My name is Dominic Garcia, and welcome to Zbrush Creature Concepting with segue into 3D printing. Now, that latter part, there's just a really fancy way of saying we're going to branch off into talking a little bit about 3D printing. But first and foremost, it's really about Zbrush and how we can use it to creature concept, quickly iterate, and get out a lot of really fun sculpts. And eventually, hope to print those out. So a little bit about myself. I'm Dominic Garcia, as I said, and I'm an instructor for the Center for Entertainment Arts. And my role is primarily that of a sculpting instructor. I teach for both the foundation program and for the advanced program. I can honestly say that Zbrush is my bread and butter. It is truly a great artistic love of mine. I've been doing this seriously, professionally for about 5 years now, and I can honestly say Zbrush has changed my life. It's what I love to do. That's what I love to teach. So I'm hoping to impart maybe a few tips and tricks tonight. As mentioned, Zbrush Advanced Creature Sculpting is the title of this workshop. So it's going to be no holds bar, going to be blasting full steam ahead with some techniques that perhaps you're familiar with, perhaps they're new to you. So feel free to pose questions either in chat or after the presentation, or there could be some time left. That said, I will be working with a custom UI. Anything that I might use that perhaps you don't know where to find, I'll try to indicate in the proper menus so that anyone could find those. I'd hate for me to press a button real quick and you to miss out on what I actually did. So I'll ensure that I try to show you everything I do behind the scenes, despite it being on a hotkey, or if this UI looks unfamiliar to you. Don't worry, we'll go through all of it. I'm going to return here just to my reference and a little bit more about what I've been working on lately. For the past few weeks now, I've been working on a collection called Invaders, which is a personal concept series of outer space kaijus, heavily inspired by crustaceans and other aquatic creatures of that sort. So it's a loose fantasy world. Without having to name specific IPs or properties, you might be able to guess, but I have a penchant, a love for men in rubber suits, classic kind of kaiju films, tokusatsu films, Super Sentai, stuff like that. It's left a very deep impression on me ever since I was a youngin', and it persists even today in my sculpts. This series is also intended for printing. Full disclosure, my journey into 3D printing is a relatively new one. I've been printing for just about under a year now, so there's a lot of kind of tricks of the trade that I'm still coming to grasp with, and perhaps I can teach you more via my blunders than my successes, as I'm probably closer to a complete beginner when it comes to printing. So full disclosure. These are a couple of the ones that I've come up with lately. It's thematic, as you can see, right? And it's heavily crustacean inspired. There are more to come. So I hope you can find those on my social, my ArtStation, for updates on this series here. Right. So part of what I wanted to talk about today is how one can find really inspiration anywhere. Right, so if you're ever at a loss for inspiration, it's easier to come across than you might suspect. So that big voice in the sky isn't always going to hit you in the creative process. It could be something as simple as just looking out your window or moseying home from campus. So in this instance here, you might notice the background image. This is the Kwantlen campus, the CEA campus where I teach in person, and there is a community garden there, or a garden at least for the agriculture program. This is probably at the height of summer where the sunflowers were well in bloom before they were wilting, and this caught my eye as being some interesting shapes from which I could draw inspiration. So I show this to you because it needn't be something much more complicated than this that you can draw forms from. So you can really extrapolate interesting shapes from pretty much anything. Nobody does it better than nature. So always keeping an eye around for potential sources of inspiration, despite how mundane they might appear at first glance, right? This is where I started from, these pictures, and it diverged pretty quickly from there. All right, so in terms of process, in terms of design, the model that I'm showing you now, well, intended for print, is also a concept or a design sculpt. So this isn't going to be something that I'm making with the intent of it being a rigged model or for VFX production or feature animation. It's more of a concept sculpt, and concept sculpts have more in common with files for 3D printing than you might think, right? Topology isn't necessarily an issue. The amount of resolution that you're hoping to get out of this sculpt might not be as much as you might need for something that is subdivided as a production or a VFX mesh would be. No UVs, and there would be no textures. So we can start pretty rough and we can keep it fairly rough all the way until the end of the process. So from here, right, it really does begin as a quick sketch, okay? Thumbnailing is something crucial, something essential for the beginning of any design process, whether it's communication design, whether you are designing a character, or even one might do thumbnails for UI or interface, something like that. Typically, I would explore a lot more than this, right? If I were to give this to you as a class assignment, you'd likely be doing 50 thumbnails. In this case here, I felt like I was kind of finding the direction already with, well, half a dozen. These are not really to scale, but they're really, really small. So I say thumbnail, right up here, sketch, but they really are just that. They're teeny tiny sketches, or thumbnails rather, that are meant to be thrown away, or at least just to be a jumping point for something much bigger. So it'll be quick, they're supposed to be dirty, and they're supposed to be disposable, right? It should take you 5 seconds to iterate on this pretty quickly, and they're cheap. And so it began as a sketch. And it's at this point we're going to jump back into ZBrush. So you might have seen this already. Spoiler. This is currently where the project sits. We'll show you how we arrived at this research, these silhouettes here, and perhaps do one more together and look at some of the ways that I would go about doing that. I have these lumped roughly together under research or R&D and then iterating. Right? This is part of the design process. And so there's overlap, there's back and forth there, but we could roughly say these fall under R&D/iteration, right? This is the design phase. This is really the most fun that you're gonna have. So without further ado, let's jump into ZBrush. And here we go. Right, here's that very same lineup that you saw as a thumbnail. And let's just look at something maybe perhaps a bit brighter here. We'll go to MapCat Gray. Okay, so here's the lineup as it stands. And these are all variations on an original mesh. Everything starts as a sphere, and then it grows from there. Stretch it, pull it, add deformers, play around with it, and really have fun and trying to find some interesting different variety from a common piece of geo, right? So all of this started from a simple sphere, and we arrived at multiple different designs. We'll talk a bit more of what motivated these design changes or why it was that I chose to do certain things here. But before we look at that, let's actually look at square one, which very humbly was a sphere, right? So this is the base component that I used to begin the rest of this creature. Now I don't have the other inspirations on this board that we were looking at here, but you can safely say that it's inspired by a big G kaiju. A big fan of anything Godzilla and anything in that world. So I've always got that in the back of my mind, even if I'm not copying it kind of verbatim, one-to-one, and that design language is always in the back of my head. There's a particular creature called Biolante, a Godzilla villain, a classic Godzilla villain that has definitely inspired this particular sculpt, right? But it did begin simply as a sphere, working heavily with Dynamesh, sometimes Sculptress Pro, pushing and pulling to find some sort of interesting shapes. This melted look, this heavy drooping sag of a kind of beard became a pretty prevalent and recurring theme throughout all the inspiration, but it really just did begin as a simple sphere. Right? So we might take it from the ground up. Perhaps we'll start from the start. So here's an initial block up. Oh, maybe let's start new here. I'm just going to append a new sphere in, and I'm just going to isolate this while tossing it into Dynamesh. And try to keep it at a fairly low resolution. I'm always ensuring that my thumbnail is active so that I get a good sense of the silhouette and whether it's working or not. So a big part of what is going to drive visual interest in your design is, does it have a strong thumbnail? And any kind of subsequent detail I think rides on that. So the initial read, your first outline, is really going to be what draws a viewer in, or what makes a toy even attractive, or a 3D print. So the thumbnail, the silhouette, really is key to any other details later in the process, right? So there's not really a lot of magic here. This is pretty bread and butter for anyone who's done any sculpting in Zbrush. Right. What might be different in my process is that I do make a good use of deformers in using the transpose to get some interesting variety. So using transpose and the deformers to iterate very quickly is something I like to do a lot. First things first, I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to block out just a rough idea of what I want. Now, I'm not 100% committed to the Cyclops single eye design of the previous iterations. Perhaps since we've already got that here, maybe I'll go in with a double eye design. This makes me think in terms of reference and what it was that drew me first of all to this sunflower. And I think what I like here is the big drooping leaves and the long drooping petals, as well as the repeated elements that the seeds themselves make. So there's big kind of floppy forms here, as well as this really dense pattern. And in trying to establish some of that pattern, I want to show you guys a couple interesting techniques too. So I'm just going to find an interesting shape here, try to find that silhouette. You note that I'm not trying to keep it super literal, right? Despite that being a sphere, at the center of a sunflower typically is a sphere. It's not really something that I'm married to. When I take design elements out of, say, a photograph, it needn't be exactly the same shape, exactly the same silhouette. It's an inspiration. It's a starting point. Right, so when you're designing your creature, it doesn't have to be as on the nose as it's a sunflower with teeth and eyeballs. Yeah. So I'm just really looking for interesting shapes, primarily the silhouette. Okay. So something as simple as this kind of mushy blob, I can then duplicate and iterate on. So this is the beginning really of the exploration. And much like those really quick thumbnails, I try to treat ZBrush blockouts in the same way. Okay. I'm going to come up here, I'm going to take a screenshot and just leave that there so I can keep referring back to it while I work on this duplicate. So I'm going to make a duplicate here, hide the original, and I'm going to jump into the gizmo, double on your keyboard, and I'm going to kill world-based symmetry, reset my gizmo, and center my pivot. There you can go see it's right in the middle of the mesh. And I'm going to hop into the deformers here, this little cog icon on my gizmo, right? Now there's a couple in here that I really like and I find quite useful. Some of them not so much. Ones I certainly will use a lot are something like bend arc, taper, twist. Let's start with bend arc, because I find that this is pretty low-hanging fruit as far as getting some interesting silhouettes go. If you've had any experience, or if you played around with these gizmo deformers at all, you'll know that they're a bit funky, right? None of the handles really make a lot of sense. Each of them are slightly different from one another. The taper handles might be different than that of the bend arc. And so the best thing I do, and this actually lends to this workflow, is experiment. You never quite know what you're going to get, so don't be afraid of pressing the wrong buttons. So here's something, I'm kind of liking this, more tapered. Accept that one. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep duplicating it out. I'll take this one here too, and I'm going to make a screenshot and keep on going. So this next version here, I'll come back in, again, hop into my gizmo, and I'm going to use transformers again. One thing when you're iterating is taking something further than it needs to be. So in this case, if I see that taper occurring at the crown of the head, perhaps I might go down to the bottom and flare it out even more. Right, so exaggerating those forms to an extreme to see how far you can push it, if the reads are still interesting, or if they're becoming too kind of obscured, or if they're going to be too silly, or perhaps they're just too far away from your initial idea. Right. So bearing that in mind, let's come back to those thumbnails and sort of see those original idea generation. Right. Here, we quite literally went with the sunflower being more of a wheel or a sphere. This is starting to look as if it's kind of deviating a bit too much from that. But that's not to worry, right? All of these shapes could end up being interesting components for kit bashing later. Okay? So while I might start this way and abandon the exploration, that's totally fine. I would always keep these pieces, right? And as you can see here, I do have a folder that I've entitled Kit Bash, which we'll explain shortly. Okay. So I think I've made a decision. I've sort of deviated a little bit too much from my original source in these thumbnails here. Not that that's the end of the world, but I would like to kind of keep some coherency between my ZBrush thumbnailing and what I've got going here, or my ZBrush sketching and my thumbnails. So I might try to return this to more of a spheroid type of shape. Perhaps let's do that again with some more bend, but in the front. And I'll hop back into the regular gizmo and just kind of pull it out here. Working in the round is important. Let's just clear this canvas. So while the silhouette is getting a lot of attention from the front, it might be lacking from the sides, right? So don't neglect to tumble your model. And let's bring symmetry back here. I might do some more of this with sculpting. When it comes time to sketching, I don't really have any surprises. It's really just the bread and butter brushes, clay buildup, clay, nothing fancy. It's really the same 5 brushes that you see every artist use. Okay. And I definitely contend that you can pretty much achieve anything with a few brushes. I particularly like the clay buildup because of the additional surface noise it gives you for free. It tends to spark the imagination, help you see some shapes that maybe you weren't intending. You can get that for free sometimes, what you might call a happy accident. Yeah. All right. So I know that I'm going to add petals to this. I think that there's some essential things that can't really be left out from this sculpt without it being too far removed from my original source material. So knowing that I'm going to have petals and leaves, I'll probably delete some of those really spiky bits. And I'm just trying to find some interesting shapes here, just sketching it out, just as if you would sketch on a piece of paper. Right. Hoping to find something interesting. Also part of the reason we keep this resolution fairly low. Right. So it's at this point I'm starting to see maybe something that wasn't intended, but I might be able to work with. So I'm going to do a mask and move, and what I see is perhaps like some jowls. And I'm going to push that idea a bit. So I'm letting the sculpt lead me a little bit. Let's flip that mask. Okay, I'm going to unhide those other ones and just explode it using expose. So Shift X or expose, however you want to call it. I don't know what they actually call it. That's Shift X to blow it apart, and you can see all your visible subtools arrayed like this. Okay, so that's quite a departure from the initial sketch, but let's go with it. All right, let's see where this leads us. Let's take it a little further here. I'm going to return to Matcap Gray, and let's see if we don't like this kind of wrinkly face. It's starting to look like Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, right away here, I'm going to use an insert mesh. So that's insert multi-mesh BIM for the brush. And we're going to use insert primitives. I've got this on my UI because they just are so versatile. So I'm going to hit M here. You might notice that the ribbon up top is hidden. I find that to be quite obnoxious, and I need as much screen real estate as possible. So if you're using an IMM brush or an insert multi-mesh brush and you can't see that ribbon, right, in this instance, you can still see the parts that are inside. Right, so I'll call to your attention this number right here, the 14 indicating however many pieces are attached to that brush. So I can't see the 14 obviously, but if I hit M, I can see all the components and that insert. Right, in this case, I want spheres, and I have brush depth on my UI as well, so that I can control how far or how on the surface these are going to insert. You can find that under your brush menu, depth, and then it's that very same icon. That thin black line indicates the surface of your mesh into which you're inserting, and then if you just grab this little kind of GUI, or you can grab this embed slider, and that will control how far out this sphere is going to put in. In this case, I'm doing some big old eyeballs, so something like that'll be good. I love insert brushes for many reasons. One of them is because as soon as you draw them out, you get a mask for free. So the surface into which you drew that IMM is going to be masked when you insert the sphere. And then if you go into your gizmo, I just hit W here into the move of your transpose, it's already locked to the center of that newly inserted mesh. Very convenient. You don't have to reset the pivot. You don't have to find it. It's already locked to the center of that piece, which is great because I can move this then on the local axis. Right, so for instance, if I had inserted this too shallow or too far out of the surface, I can quickly jump into the local transforms and then adjust it with the gizmo. Very useful. Something like that. Okay, so additionally, another really useful feature here is that you get polygroups for free anytime you use an insert brush, which allows us to split by groups. So I got that on a hotkey here. I'm going to go groups split. It exists under your split menu, and group split just over yonder. Okay, so we're going to split these out from the head itself and the eyes. You can go group split. You can go split by masked in this case. Up to you. If you lose the mask, though, we need to use the polygroups, and we're going to go groups split. Perfect. Now, I'm a big stickler for naming. In this case, definitely want to name these subtools. This project is getting increasingly more complicated. So the more subtools you have, the better idea it is to name it. So use folders, use naming conventions, certainly helpful. I'm just going to call this head blockout or something that's useful for you, or, provided you pass this over to another artist, the last thing you'd want is for them to have to discern what 40 pieces of your mesh are. All right, we're gonna call these eyeballs. It's just yourself, name it whatever you want. Call it, I don't know, Alpha Gettys, doesn't really matter. Just gonna quickly do a dynamic subdiv on the eyeballs, smooth them out a bit. Just hitting D on the keyboard or coming down here to geometry, and we just divided the eyeballs, right? Just to give them a bit of a smooth. Let's come back to this head. Okay, so certainly strayed quite a bit here from the sunflower motif, but something I certainly want to keep here. The silhouette's okay, not bad, very kind of squishy, angular triangle thing. I want to push some more of those strands. I quite like what's happening here, and it almost reads to me like a cool haircut, really aggressive hairstyle. And so I think I'd like to make a new component for this to then duplicate around the top of this head. All right, so let's go ahead there. And again, as with everything, you can just start from a sphere. So I'm going to append or insert rather a sphere here. I'm going to solo that. I've got solo bound to Z, but usually it's there in that small ribbon in the center, Z or Z, what have you. Okay, and so let's make a pedal. Once again here, I'm going to go into my gizmo. When you append a subtool, it doesn't have symmetry on by default, and so you don't also need to worry about centering up your pivot. It should already be perfectly in the middle. So I'm going to hop right into the gizmo there, and I'm going to stretch it out just along the Z axis, working top down. And then I'm going to hop again into this transform type. I'm going to give it a taper. Once again, we'll do that along Z. Okay. And flare the back a little bit, just something like that. And I'll show you a couple ways to do this. This is one way we can do it. Once you're happy, you can just hit W again, or to go back to your regular transpose, or hit that cog and hit accept. Right, then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to scale it in along Y until I got something like that. This is more than enough to get a simple shape for a petal or a leaf. Okay, so let's say that's the leaf, and maybe we'll tackle the petal in a different way. Okay, so I'll name this leaf. Right. Gonna unsolo here, I'm gonna take that leaf, and I suppose I could have made it looking down Z, top down doesn't quite matter. When I do kit bash, I've always got multiple copies, so it's not the end of the world. Something like this. Now, if this shape were something quite a bit more difficult to make, other than just tapering and squashing it a bit, I might duplicate it and keep it as a separate component. In this case, though, I'm not so in love with it that I have to do that and return to the initial blockout. It wouldn't be so hard to do that shape again. So in this case, I'm just gonna brute force it. I want to give it some subtle kind of bend and some roundness, and I'm going to use the gizmo again here. But this is a relatively new thing in the life of ZBrush, whereby you can affect the fall off of the transpose gizmo by changing the focal shift. So by default, when you're in the transpose tool, focal shift is set to -100. If you go anything greater than that, it begins to affect the subtool in a different way. So hopefully you can see that. And it's proximity based as well. So if I change the focal shift to anything other than -100 default, and I reorient this gizmo, you can see how it begins to give it a bit of a bend. So I'll put it even more into the positive, and I can get something like this, right? Now at some point, it's going to start to pinch the surface, and that's akin to something else I'll show you in a bit, which is using move and AccuCurve. You can get these kind of interesting strong pinches. But if that's not something that you wanted and you want it to be a bit more subtle, then you just move the gizmo further away. So in this case, you unlock, move it, lock it again, or you can hold Alt temporarily to unlock your gizmo, reposition it, and then let the lock go back, and then it will actually affect the surface of your mesh. All right, so we'll go like this, something like that. We'll reset our pivot. We'll put it back into place in the center of that leaf, roughly. Make sure that we've changed our focal shift back to -100, and then we can just hammer this back into place. So that's one way you could do it. You could also use a great big move brush. It's up to you. I'm gonna grab this guy here, and in your gizmo holding control, you can duplicate that mesh out. I'm gonna hold shift to rotate it. And then I'll just scale it, something like this. Okay, I'm going to come down here to modify topology here, and I'm going to mirror and weld. There you go, mirror and weld, and I'm going to get copies identical on either side. All right, so in this case, grammar, leaves, there you be. All right. So paying attention to my thumbnail here. Oops. Okay. So in addition to the leaves, I'd like to do some petals. So the next thing here I'm going to do is make some petals and then show you an interesting way to duplicate them very quickly and efficiently. All right, so the technique I'm going to use here lives under the mask pen. So I'm going to grab the mask pen, holding Control, and I'm going to grab Mesh Extrude. So Mesh Extrude is really great. It's a nice, fun way. Any of these mesh balloon, mesh splat, these are very, very fun Zbrush tools. I think they're highly underrated. You can get some pretty cool stuff with them. We're going to use Mesh Extrude. All right, so to use this, you need to start on the mesh itself, so hovering on top of the surface. If you don't begin the Mesh Extrude, it's going to operate just like a regular mask lasso. Okay. However, if I begin my mask starting on the surface of a subtool or on top of a mesh and I draw it out, okay, the positive space here is going to turn into a mesh. So if I let go of this here, these shapes can be quite a bit more complicated too. Okay. So this is kind of feather-like or leaf-like. We're going for a petal. I might redraw this one more time with a little less girth. Let's see, we'll undo that. We'll do one more. And I don't much mind if there isn't symmetry there, that's totally fine. If I isolate this and I look at the topology, another reason I like Mesh Extrude is because it's going to give you polygroups with edge loops and also creases along those edges for free. We can use this to good effect with some other techniques to just polish it up and get some nice topology, right? Not necessary, we don't have to, but it would give us extra control so that we can use deformers later on. So what I'm going to do here, okay, is since I have polygroups, I want to make it so that this bevel is included in that additional edge loop along the side. So using my select rectangle, I am going to just Control Shift click on the purple part of this leaf, or rather, let's see the purple parts, both purple parts, to isolate them. And then I'm left with just this border edge here, okay? With that border edge visible only, the rest is hidden. I'm going to come down to my polygroups, or you can just hit Control W. What I'm going to do is a group visible. So polygroups, and we're going to go group visible right here. Or you can go Control W. There you go. So now, of course, Zbrush is going to give me the color most alike to the ones that I've hid there. I'm going to undo and just go one more time until I get something a bit more contrasted. There you go, orange. Okay. So now instead of the 3 polygroups along that bevel, I've got just the top and bottom of the leaf as well as the border edge. Okay, so once again here, I'm going to split these out so I can do some additional operations. I'm going to Control Shift click on the head twice. I'm going to go split hidden, right? That also lives up here under your split menu. We can go split hidden. Nothing's hidden here. It's already been split out. Be careful not to do group split, because in that case of this bevel here, you're going to split out both halves of this petal. We don't want that. All right. So there's the petal, nice and clean. It could be cleaner. So let's come into now ZRemesher. Looking at ZRemesher, and we're just going to tidy this up even more so I can use some deformers on it. So I'm going to allow keep groups. Adaptive is fine. Target poly count, I'd like it fairly low. I'm going to probably drop it down to something like 2, and these are in the thousands, so 2 indicates around 2,000 polys. We'll just hit it a ZRemesh. Hope for the best. Okay, not so bad. Perhaps we'll go half once more. See how far we can push it, because we're going to make quite a few of these. Yeah, something like that is fine. If we're losing too much of the silhouette, perhaps like that, but we will subdivide this afterwards anyway, so not the end of the world. We can quickly just jump into subdiv and see what that looks like, hitting D. And that looks pretty good. So there's our base component. We're going to call this a petal. And now we are going to duplicate this around the surface of our head. So I'm going to give him kind of a collared look. All right. So while I could take this, jump into my gizmo and control drag out and duplicate this in that fashion, it would be very tedious, and I don't really want to spend the time doing that. We can do it in a much more efficient way, and I'd like to do that with something called array mesh. Okay, so now that we've got this basic component here, take that petal and we are going to array it. Right? So here it is, array mesh. Somewhat of an intimidating menu if you've never used it before, or if you've kind of gone into it and been kind of timid and messed around with it, and you couldn't quite get the results you wanted. There is a lot going on here, but we'll try to demystify it for you just a little bit. So my intention is to radially duplicate all of these petals around the head. Okay, and I want to do that in a non-destructive manner. Okay. So I want to do this in such a way where I can always modify this original piece while still retaining this radial duplication. So how do you do that? You do that with array mesh. So I'm going to turn this on, array mesh, nothing's going to happen. And the way I like to control this is with the transpose. So we're familiar with this gizmo. I hate to call this the legacy transpose. Let's just call it the transposed line, but some of you might remember when this lovely gizmo was non-existent and we had to get away with just the transposed line. Right, so if you're familiar with this, this will be less difficult if this is the first time you're encountering the transposed line because you've just been so spoiled with the regular gizmo. Then this might be more of an uphill battle. It's worth learning, I would say, even if it's maybe more of a hidden feature at this point. Okay, so to activate the transposed line from your gizmo, right? Whether you're in move, scale, or rotate. So in this case, I'm in move, W, they're all the same, right? You hit Y on your keyboard and you'll be greeted with this line, okay? So I'll take for granted perhaps that you've never used this before. The line needs to be drawn out, okay? And it has to be drawn out in 3D space, right? It'll be perpendicular to your view. Parallel, I suppose. Depends on where you draw it out. Okay. And so I'm going to draw it out so that it is in line with this piece that I want to then transpose. Okay. This will take some practice. Mess around with it first, perhaps without needing to worry about array mesh. You can still use this as a regular transpose. So if I grab this center circle and then it highlights that white reticle, I grab that, I'll move it around. Grab the other circles, move them as well. There's some strange operations, right? If I want to move this, I'm in move. If I want to scale it, I'll hit E and I can scale or rotate. Okay. So we're going to turn transpose on in array mesh. Okay. And you'll see that nothing has happened, right? Other than now we have stage and repeat. So if I disable that, those items will be hidden. Okay, so I'm going to turn transpose on, and stage 1 is what we're going to be working on, and we're going to change the amount of repetitions. So this number indicates how many additional petals are going to be generated here. You can also change this under the menu itself. Okay, repeat, this is going to be the same as the repetitions here. So if I drag this slider or over here, this is also a slider. It's the same thing, right? You'll see that they will change with one another. Let's do a modest 20 to start. Okay. Okay. And now this is where the pivot is going to matter a bit more. You'll see that there's this yellow circle in the center of this bottom one here. That's going to be the center from which the duplicates are going to radiate out from, right? So that's going to be the pivot, essentially. So if you take that yellow circle, now that you have some repetitions on, let's move that down. I'm going to say that this is going to radiate from the center of the head. Okay. And now if I grab this very topmost circle, hit R for rotate, I can grab this and I can fan it out. I might have to do it in stages. Okay, so don't try to do the whole 360 in a row. Okay. So that will give me the orientation with repetitions. If I want more or less, I can always come back in there and I can change to more or less. I think 20 was working okay. Wasn't too busy. All right. Now my initial thought is that this is perhaps too symmetrical, too obvious that it's been duplicated this way. And so this is gonna naturally need some sculpting up afterwards, some breakup of symmetry. Maybe we'll even delete a few, we'll see. All right, so in addition to this rotation here, we can also change its position. So part of the reason that I really like this sunflower is the kind of, what would you call, heavenly geometry of it, sacred geometry of its rotations. And we can kind of mimic that effect here too. Now, given the time, we'll see if we can do this, but there is a way that we might be able to replicate this with the seeds. I don't know. Let's try it first with these petals, but I think that they're a bit too samey. Let's change that then. Let's take the gizmo again. Let's draw it out towards Z, and let's use the move. And all we need to do very simply is just pull this forward, this second circle. And now you'll see that the profiles here under array mesh are changing. Okay, so as I drag this forward in that middle circle back and forth, those are going to change. Okay. Now it's here that you might want to return to your rotation. So I'm going to draw out this line again, top down. And I can affect the rotation once again. Right, so now I'm getting some overlap as well as depth. And again, you need to kind of do this a couple times. All right, so here's the great power of it too. If I find that there's some gaps here that I don't quite like, I can always change the repetitions. But I quite like the overlay. I like how we're breaking up some of that monotony. Yeah, so we have a couple rows of it. And if they're not stacked, or if they are too stacked, something like this. Right. Now I'm not going to have them sit too close to one another, because if you recall, we went ahead and we had zero mesh these so that we can then later use some deformers, right? So I'm going to give them some thickness. Right. Now, part of this, if it were to be printed thin pieces, well, they can be printed fairly well, okay, with some careful setup. I tend to like thicker, chunkier details. They tend to read a little better. So exaggerating everything up a couple degrees would probably lend to a more appealing miniature. Of course, it depends on what your intents are, but for myself, I like something a little chunkier. All right, so if we're happy with this transpose, all we need to do is go make mesh, and then it's going to be committed as geometry. As it is, you can see here, despite my polyframe on, despite my being on the one subtool, these other petals that we've generated are simply a preview. So they're not yet geometry. If I want to sculpt on these, I have to make mesh. All right, but also with that in mind, if I turn array mesh off, I can simply go back to the original subtool. Now we did all that. I would certainly like to keep this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make mesh. And there you go with the line fill on there, or the polyframe, you'll see that these petals are now actual geometry. One pet peeve of mine is that this doesn't duplicate it out as a separate subtool, right? This is going to completely change the original geo. So if you want that original piece, make sure you do a duplicate before you make mesh, right? In this case, not the end of the world. Okay. All right, let's take a look at that with a quick smooth. So to give it some girth, we're going to do this, provided you haven't done an auto group or changed the poly grouping. Now all of the front and back of the petals are the same poly group. They're all color coded the same. We're going to go into our Z modeler. So if we bring up our brushes and we look for Z modeler right there, should be the last brush for you, second to last, third to last rather. If you don't have any other custom brushes, BZM is your hotkey. Okay. And I'm just going to hover over a polygon, so be careful. This is contextual depending on the component. So be sure that you're not hovering over a point or a vert or an edge. You're going to hover over a polygon, right? And holding space bar to get these actions, I'm going to go extrude. And then under the modifier here, I'm going to go extrude polygroup all. Okay, so now when I do an extrusion operation here, it's going to pull these petals, all of these petals, both front and back. Okay, so there you can see that that's the active operation. I'm going to click this. I'm going to drag it forward just a wee, just to give it some thickness. We'll do a preview smooth there like that. Right, so I much prefer that kind of thickness. Something like that, a bit more exaggerated. Perfect. Right, that's all really we have to do. The rest is just going to come with sculpting this mesh up. Now, generally, I don't work with dynamic subdivisions a whole lot. I prefer just active or just regular subdivisions. So what I'll do here with smooth on is I'll just come into geometry, divide this a couple times. 100,000 is fine for that many pieces, and I'll be happy with that. I'm just going to delete lower subdivs, so now they're nice and smooth. Yeah. All right, so it's at this point too that I would come in here and start to give them some kind of individual character, or just give them some variety, sculpt them up. And for this here, you're definitely going to need to use the Move Topological brush. So it's a close cousin to Move, but it allows you to manipulate these individual petals without affecting its neighbor. So by way of example, if I use the regular Move brush and I just want to manipulate one of these petals, you'll see that the fall off, no matter what I do, is going to pick up some of those adjacent pieces. I don't want that, so I'd like to control each of these petals individually. And so I'm going to use the Move Topological brush just next to the regular old Move. Okay, there you go. And now you'll see that if I move one of these petals, the adjacent ones are not being affected. That's exactly what I want. Now, before I do this, though, I am going to return back to my regular gizmo. And I'm going to center that up, and I'll just scale it in so it crashes into the head a bit more. All right. Crashing is totally fine. So if ever you 3D print something, you don't need to worry about crashed or hidden geo. Once you get it into your slicing program, not to worry at all. It's going to print as if it were a single volume. There's a few caveats there, but in this case, it would be totally fine if you have crashing pieces, right? So with this Move Topological now, I can give these some kind of variety, right? Some additional bend. Doesn't have to be too much, just something to give them a sense of waviness. Pull them this way and that. Again, working in the round here is important because if I have an interesting silhouette from the front, it may not necessarily be the case if I'm to look at this from the side or even just a 3/4 angle. So working in the round will help break up that monotony. Okay, so just that little bit of pushing and playing around here is enough to give it a sense of breakup and asymmetry. Certainly the face is still too symmetrical, so I might think about doing something there, but that's at a later stage, right? So there's the head. I got some leaves and some petals. Also at this point, I think it's useful to add poly paint. In the design phase, it's never too early to really add poly paint. It can help you separate elements out, help you find those happy accidents too. So I'm going to enable poly paint here. I'm going to select these petals, and I'm going to choose something sunflower petalish. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go RGB mode, and if you go to your color, fill object, it'll flood everything. If RGB is 100%, it should be, but I can fill this. A bit more saturation, a little lower in value. So it'll also depend on your matte cap or your material. Right, something like that. This guy I'm going to give kind of up in air about this one. Depends on the kind of character I want to give it. And now I'm going to fill a material for the eyeballs as well. I like always having a bit of a spec hit, so I'm not only going to fill RGB information, I'm going to fill material channel as well. So instead of just RGB, I'm going to flip over to mRGB, and one that I like to go to always is toy plastic, because you get that spec hit. That lives over here in your materials. Okay? So if you go into your material palette, you're looking for toy plastic, and it will give you that nice shiny spec. Okay. I'll give it a bit of a tint. The white is a bit much. All right. Don't hate that cream. I think it's kind of working. Might paint it a bit as well using a paintbrush. Let's BPA. And just isolate those. Put symmetry on here and just feather in a little color from the back. Perfect. Okay, let's switch this back to our regular matte cap. So periodically too, I'm going to do a little BPR render. You can hit Shift R to do BPR. And again, depending on your material, your lighting, or your render settings, right? Your shadows are probably more harsh than mine. I have some soft shadows enabled here, but this is still, when you do this periodically, it's useful to check your values, right? So if you have interesting shadows on your sculpt, right, periodically to do a BPR render is a good thing, right? So in addition to the poly paint rendering every now and then to help check your sculpt. All right, so let's see here. Okay, now without having to do the whole sculpt here, I'm going to jump back to the examples that I started with. This is the process that I arrived at all these other sculpts anyway, so there's nothing really mysterious there. The array mesh, the use of gizmo, mesh extrude, and a little tiny use of ZModeler. Okay, so I'm going to hide these. I'll just make a new folder here, stream. Folders, such a godsend. Okay, there we go, hide those down. And let's look at the ones that I've already created over here. Okay, let's kill that momentarily. Okay. All right, so here I have a lineup, and let's come back to our demo here. After the sketch, after the research, we have also the development, the iteration. So this is a big part of the exploring. Now you might do more or less exploring in the sketching Dynamesh phase, or you might have a complete character blocked out, but then I would still go in there and kind of push some of those elements, or even push it so far that you get something entirely new. Right, so one can still discern that these silhouettes are similar. They're part of the same universe, if you want to say that, or they share the same kind of design prompts, but they are different. So we're going to iterate on these a couple times. If we come back to Zbrush here, right, I've got, they were named after the fact, right, inspired by the shapes I kind of came up with serendipitously, right? Bad posture, seems fairly self-explanatory. This guy here. We've got our wizard, arguably also very bad posture. And then our brontosaurus. Okay. They share the same design language because they share the same components. So I arrived at these shapes simply by, again, using the gizmo and using deformers to change the silhouette. So I was, again, prioritizing silhouette, not worrying too much about how it mangled or stretched any pieces, because I was just trying to find some interesting design changes, right? Now, it's pretty easy to go in here and push something more into an angular shape for more energy, right? Or something more solid and kind of safe like a square. Right? If you've done any design, right, these shapes all communicate different things, right? there's a feeling to them, or something more rounded, more soft and approachable, right? This is a pretty easy way to iterate if you just try to force your shapes into something more akin to these geometric forms, right? And then the rest is just details, but prioritizing silhouette is something I cannot really emphasize enough, okay? So it doesn't have to be, again, one-to-one, a square, a circle, and a triangle. That's a good way to think about just changing your shapes up. So here's some exploration. All of these were poly painted also. Okay. None of them were really detailed very much. They all have the same starting components. Some removed, some added, but really all just the same geo. Okay. It's meant to be quick, not meant to be precious. You're just trying to find shapes before you really commit to detailing. So this is still very much exploration. Okay. Another part of this too, and I think is really important, not just building up your kind of visual library of how you like to sculpt, but as you progress and you work on personal projects, you can begin to steal from yourself. So I didn't take anything from this series here, but I did take something from previous sculpt that ended up as a 3D print. So perhaps this is where the segue begins, right? And we'll begin with just talking about kit bashing a bit. So if we look at the initial blockout that I had begun with, let's come over here. Again, this is the same processes that we had just looked at, the array mesh. Okay. Okay. So I'll call your attention to these arms here, right, that live in the kit bash folder. This is the original sketch of the head. That was the first kind of starting off point of the idea. You can actually see those insert meshes that occurred here, these little bumps, right? These arms, however, are lifted from a project that is very, very different than this one. Well, perhaps not super different, as he is also a giant monster. Okay, and this was taken from another project because they seem to suit the giant monster theme quite easily. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load that up once again. I had a crash earlier, and so I've lost it, so may as well bring it up one more time. Yeah, crashes are fun. It happens to all of us. Okay, and then this might be quite minuscule as it's already been prepared for print, but let's see what we got here. Okay. All right, here he is, everybody's favorite space turtle, friend of children, protector of the universe. Okay. But you can see that the arms were taken from this sculpt and then later used as a piece for this guy here, okay? So this is literally the exact same arm, take it from there, appended to this sketch mesh, but then later really smoothed out and changed, okay? So it's been deformed quite a bit, didn't take it one for one because this guy is not really fleshy, okay? But I use that as a starting point, right? So that's in the kit bash there. In addition to that, I used Z-spheres to establish the blockout for the body. I'm a big fan of Z-spheres. They lend very, very well to iterating quickly and experimentation. And then from there, that's how we started to sketch out the rest of these experiments. And so the kit bash also contains something like this seed here, which I don't think I have time to go into. There's a couple little fun things we can do to get these these patterns, right? But this was a case of trying to work smarter, not harder, right? Working quickly, not getting too bogged down and having to make everything bespoke. Z-spheres are great. If you're not using Z-spheres, I highly recommend it. All right. Okay, so I use this piece in there, just the arm, but I wanted to look at this mesh as well, just to jump into printing. Okay, so in this particular case, I'm working from existing IPs, a concept that was already developed and fairly well established. I mean, that's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you have to very closely kind of be married to your references, especially if you're going for a likeness. But on the other hand, it's very freeing because you don't have to do any designing, right? So this demo is more about design, but this one here was more about focusing on just getting something to print right away. And so I wasn't really messing around with the design elements. Sculpted just like we did with the other kaiju, other character, the sunflower guy. Start from a sphere, pull it, push it, sculpt it up. And eventually, the difference is I wanted this to be printed fairly large. So let's come back over here. Okay. Refinement stage we won't quite get into today, I'm afraid. Okay. But now we're getting into printing. Okay, so here is the jump. Now, my print bed is only a 2K resolution, right? So these LCD matrix 3D printers, right? Resin printers, they work from a screen that exposes light through UV curing. Basically like a computer monitor with LEDs that expose themselves like a template, like a stencil, and that's what makes each layer. So it exposes at each layer a different stencil, and it cures the resin using UV light. So given that it's a screen, it's got a certain resolution, mine is 2K, and that also means practically the volume of the machine itself can only accommodate so large a piece. So if I want the sculpt, or rather the print, to be a certain size, it requires me to make multiple pieces. So almost like a model kit, right? Well, exactly like a model kit. So when it came time for me to prepare this model, I had to think about how I could best, most efficiently split it out so that I could arrive at both the size I wanted to print and also a limited amount of components. Because while I do like model kits, sometimes you don't want 50 pieces, and also as a matter of time, right, depending on some of your settings, right, these prints can take, a whole day, right? Prints can take 13 hours, more, depending on the quality and complexity and size. So we can kind of mitigate a little bit of that time by splitting it into pieces too. You will see, however, that the time is going to catch up with you in the latter half of the process, which we'll talk about also momentarily. Okay. So how did I split this out? Well, the first part is just being strategic with how you separate your subtools. So in this case, the legs are separate, the arms are separate, the head, the teeth, and the tongue, as well as the torso proper. Oh, the tail I ought to mention. So once again, let's look at that expose. So I'm going to blow this up. Okay, and what you see is what you get, right? Each of these subtools is something that is then later printed as its own piece, cleaned up and assembled, right? So each of these is the print for the kit, right? And let's just look at maybe one of these, right? So if I look at this mesh here, you will see it has this little nubbin sticking out. Okay, and now that little additive form, or the positive shape, is also got a corresponding negative shape. So it has a hole in which to plug that is found on the body. So if I look at the body here, this is maybe a more obvious example. It has what are called keyholes, right? So this mesh is keyed so that the pieces can easily find the hole in which to fit. And this also adds a little bit of stability. It's more room for the glue to kind of grip around. Right? But most importantly, it's going to allow me to split this into separate pieces when I print it. Right? Part of this too is that you can make these hollow volumes. So there is a way by which you can hollow these out to save on resin, right? If you don't want a solid mass. That has some other considerations too, particularly in the realm of cleanup, right? Closed volumes, you don't need to empty or cure resin out from the inside. In this case, you can't see that there are holes here, but when I printed it, I chose to do a empty mesh to save on resin and weight, right? Some other considerations, right? Not necessarily tied to keys, but that is something to consider. All right, so when this was actually printed, the body itself is hollow. The legs, arms, head, tail are a solid mesh. Okay. So this is what it looks like. It has been decimated, right? So I have used the Decimation Master plugin to just get the poly count size down. Triangulated, not really a big deal. Again, as I mentioned, this is a 2K printer that I'm using. And so really anything more than this, I don't have the fidelity to print anyway. So it's a moot point. Triangles, not all bad. Okay. Alrighty. So again, if we return here, let's look a little bit at the process. This is a slicing application. There are several different ones you can choose. Free versions, freemium versions. This particular one I quite like. And here it is. You can see each of these was a separate phase of printing. And you might notice there's something wrong here. If you really scrutinize these images, there's something that is amiss, which I found out after. Right? You can see the holes there. But the error in question really is, well, it's missing a limb. So I missed out on a leg, which then had to later be printed separately. Not the end of the world, it's just one relatively small component. Wasn't that big of a deal, but the problem was I printed the same leg twice, and so I had to have a mirrored version. This is the joys of discovery. Okay. So this is what it looks like in the slicing program. These little pillars here are called supports, and they help with a number of things, right? Adhering to the plate, supporting the delicate parts of a sculpt. This is a fairly robust sculpt, so maybe this is a bit overkill. Okay, and then what you're left with after printing it out, here's the print itself, right? Fresh out of the vat after many hours. Glistening and toxic, so do bear in mind if you're interested in getting into 3D printing, having a well-ventilated space is awfully important. Working on your balcony, I can tell you from experience, is not the ideal way to go about this. Temperature is certainly a big factor. 25 degrees is kind of the comfortable spot, so we're approaching the Canadian winter here. Printing in your backyard or on your balcony quickly becomes unfeasible. So having a garage, something that's well ventilated as well, can definitely be a bonus. Here it is. Okay, so right, I'm printing outside, not ideal, but we do what we can. So my printing is probably going to take a hiatus here pretty soon. We're dipping real soon in temperature. So there it is out of the resin, still glistening. After that, there's a few stages I don't have photographed, but you would clean this off, right? You would use some sort of alcohol, usually 99% IPA, isopropyl alcohol. Give it a bath, spray it down. Having a Costco membership with compressed air is awfully handy dandy. Okay, you can see those supports there printed out. There is some waste material in this process. And you can see those holes there too. So it has to be very thoroughly drained. Okay. And then once again, this needs to be cured. Also something I haven't got a photograph of, but UV light is used both in the printing process and also in the cleanup process too. So you'll note here that it's a bit more satin than when it first came out of the tub. That's because this resin has been cured in this machine behind it. It's a very simple machine. It's essentially a turntable with a timer. that exposes this print to UV light, thus curing the resin. Okay. There's the pieces cured and dried, hopefully done off gassing. Again, use a mask. Hopefully you have a well-ventilated space. Okay, and then the fun begins. So the removal of supports. There's a beautiful summer sunset for you. Okay, removal of supports, the cleanup. There's the head. All right, you can see there, not quite a key, but there is a hole that was booleaned out for the teeth. So booleans are an important part of the process for making keys. And then, as the title suggests, some assembly required. So in this instance, multiple pieces, that's how I wanted it. I like it as a garage kit. You know, I like the model making. It's gonna need some cleanup. So anywhere that there were some of those supports, right, we do our best to try and hide them. They will need some burnishing or filing, some cleanup to get rid of those excess little pieces. And then, yeah, some glue, some super glue. Now, unfortunately, regular testers model glue doesn't work on this. So if you're a war gamer or if you're used to assembling models, at least the one that I have does not work on this type of resin, this type of plastic. And so you need something quite a bit stronger. In this case, I'm using a super glue. Doesn't have to be this name brand one. I got one from a dollar store too, worked just as fine. Wear gloves. So you put it together, right? In printing, there's going to be some shrinkage here and there, or in cleanup, it might not weld perfectly. Not the end of the world. You can use some sort of filler, some sort of putty or two-part epoxy, something like that. Those are also readily available in hobby shops. So these gaps aren't going to be totally seamless, but that's fine. No model kit really is. And there he is in all his glory. You can kind of see here that he's bouncing around too. He came with me all over the place that week. Trying to work on this thing in my spare time. Okay, so from here on, you can paint it. So you would prime it perhaps and then do some painting. I'm not much of a model painter. Fully admit I like the modeling portion of it, the assembly, but my models are never really painted. So if there's any volunteers out there who would like a copy of this model to paint, and you are a savvy painter, please do reach out to me. I'd be happy to make one available. All right. Quite a lot of steps, a lot of cleanup, but fun all the way down. Now, let's see, for scale, I don't know if this is going to work. Here he is, right? About, I don't know, 18 centimeters or so. Okay, modeled after a certain line of toys commonly available in Japan. Okay, and it does have some heft on it. Okay. Right, so this is the prototype. The gaps aren't filled, it isn't painted, but quite happy with the way this one turned out. It was almost too perfect, we would say. Sometimes you channel it out, and it works just fine. This is one of those instances. It was just a happy turn of events. Okay. So let's see here. Come back to this guy. Right. Now, if I were going to print this, certainly I'd want to refine it quite a bit. I'd want to come in there and clean it up. I'd want to work on this some more. I think if I were to commit to any of these designs, I don't know. Let's see. Do we like the one that we came up with today? Let's give this a quick body perhaps and see if we can't add it to our lineup, see what we get. Okay. All right, so I'm going to take this guy, I've put it in a folder, and I'm going to just grab the cog there on that folder, and I'm going to duplicate this out. That warning, yep, totally fine. Okay. And then also in that folder here, I can activate the transpose set, so I'm affecting everything within that folder, and that folder only. Once again, I'm just going to reset this gizmo, center up my pivot, and I can come in here and just start to add some of these transformations. And this is exactly how we would go about, oops, let's hide these guys. Again, we can revisit that focal shift. We can change that out. We can give it a bit of a squash and a stretch. Perhaps something more bird-like, almost fish-like. Okay, so in this case, the eyes are distorted, but that's not the end of the world. And then maybe let's give it a little bit of a body. All right, I'm seeing that fish shape, so let's just quickly put a body in here. I'm going to use a Z-sphere. I'm going to insert that just below. Isolate that. Move it out. Okay, I'm going to scale this. Press E to go into scale. Make sure our symmetry is back on here, so hit X. Now Q to draw this out. Add in some spheres. Maybe you'll have kind of a stalking presence, something like this. So maybe this one's a bit more aggressive. It's got that strong kind of angular face now. And something that we don't have in our lineup yet is something quadrupedal. So perhaps I'll just add some hind legs here. And that's a very easy way that you can iterate, right? You can do something that's a biped, something that walks upright, perhaps, something that walks on all fours, something that slithers, right? Just work with these different art types, and you can very quickly get some different ideas, right? So without even having to look at other animal reference, right? Something like this, right? Almost like very gorilla-like. And again, it's all about that silhouette, right? Helpful to think to yourself too, would this make a fun toy, right? So if I were to hold this in my hands or my kid were to get a hold of it, would they enjoy this thing, right? So the fun factor. We didn't really talk about toy design, but it's definitely something to think about when you're designing for print too. All right, there you go. Make this an adaptive skin real quick, toss it into Dynamesh. We'll come down here, we'll go adaptive skin. Our resolution's quite high, so I'll drop this really low. Preview, that's sufficient. We'll go make adaptive skin, awesome. That's gonna spit it out here into our tools. And so I'll just hide this Z-sphere, and just below it, I'm going to insert the new skinned mesh. And I think we've got the name of our new mesh. Okay, so everything here, can merge this all down. I'm fine with it all being one piece at this point because it's just kind of a concept mesh. I'm going to go merge down and merge this whole folder. I'm going to happily put those Z-spheres away. Okay. And now I think I like the idea of calling this guy Gorilla. There we go. Let's put this into our exploration folder now. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to show you here is using Stager to set up this. Oops, don't forget to return our focal shift on the gizmo. Don't want to break stuff. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to select this newly made gorilla, and I'm going to come down here to Stager. So it's under your geometry menu. We're going to look for Stager, and the way that this works is it's going to look at the transforms where this is in space, okay, in your ZBrush space, and it's going to store it and then allow you to move it, scale it, translate it or rotate it, and then return back to that stage. Right? So first thing you need to do is you set a home stage, okay, and then you would move this into place and set the target stage. So I'm going to take this here, I'm going to go into my gizmo, I'm going to move it aside. Let's crash him into the ground here. Can even rotate him a bit. Maybe we'll scale it down. It's a big boy. I don't know if he would be the largest in the lineup. Perhaps let's even change it up. Let's make him the smallest in the lineup. All right. Okay, so we're happy with that, right? Then we'll just hit target stage. Now we've got both a target and a home stage. So if I go here now and I hit switch stage, it's going to go back to where it began when we hit home stage. And if I hit it again, it will go back to this new position. Okay. So I've done this for this lineup here. You'll see that there are stages, right? And I can quickly just put them all in a row without actually changing them. Right, there we go. There's our new addition. The last thing we could do here is perhaps just add some poly paint so they're all sitting pretty. So if we enable poly paint here, right, they all have that. Let's give him some of these red glowing eyes. Let's come over here. I'm going to sample the color of these original eyeballs so they're all consistent. You can hover over any element in your document, and if you tap C, it's going to capture that color. You will need to change the material, however, so let's go back to toy plastic. Let's make sure we're doing mRGB channel. And looking at just this isolated poly group here, Control-Shift-Click. We'll go fill object, perfect. Return back to our basic material. I think also we'll isolate this body. Let's fill it with green. Ought to have made those a single poly group. That's okay, that's not the end of the world. We'll just use our select brush here, holding Control and Shift. And let's isolate these elements, hide them. We'll do a mask, so Control Tap on the document. Let's just hide our poly paint for a moment here. And then let's go Control-Shift-Click, tap on the document to unhide, and we'll Control Tap to flip, not flip the mask, we're going to keep it as that. And then we can go ahead and we can RGB and fill. Once again, let's just unhide the rest, enable poly paint and sample that green color, so tap C. And now with only this here unmasked, we can go fill object, perfect. If I want to return to just these pieces later, I'll flip that mask once again. So I'll just turn this off. Okay, you can see the mask there, just that piece. Control tap on the document. Now the body is masked. I'm going to go ahead and make this a single poly group. So we can go group masked or Control W. There you go. Now you can see the body, if I enable my line fill, is a single poly group. Okay, to unhide everything here, turn poly paint on. Let's take a look at our lineup. Give it a render. All right. So with a little bit of work, just some basic blockouts, perhaps some advanced techniques, we were able to achieve some pretty quick iteration that also fits into the rest of the theme. And now whether we want to go into this newly created gorilla or perhaps this original versions here and start to refine it and add more detail, that's something we'd have to leave for part 2. So that also brings with it some additional considerations that I briefly touched on about if I were to print this. But the design phase, hopefully you guys had kind of a peek into how I play around with ZBrush, going from something as simple as a photograph, then a thumbnail sketch, to a whole lineup of characters. Well, that's about it. Again, my name is Dominic Garcia. working for the CEA. I love sculpture. I hope that you can tune in to another workshop in the future. Have fun sculpting.